Every spring for nearly 100 years, somewhere between 10 and 15,000 men walked out onto frozen rivers across the American Northeast and Upper Midwest. They carried nothing but a pike pole, a pair of caulked boots with steel spikes driven through the soles, and whatever nerve God gave them. Their job was to ride billions of board feet of freshly cut timber down rivers swollen with snowmelt, through rapids that could swallow a man whole, for distances that sometimes stretched over 200 miles. They called it the log drive. And if you have never heard of it, that is because the men who did it are almost entirely forgotten. Their names don't appear in history books. Their graves, when they have graves at all, sit in small-town cemeteries from Maine to Minnesota with nothing but a date and a last name carved into fieldstone. But for the better part of a century, these men were the reason America had houses, barns, railroad ties, and ships. Every board in every frontier town passed through their hands first, and the price they paid for that work was measured in broken bones, frozen limbs, and bodies pulled from river bends weeks after the drive had moved on. This is the story of the log drive, how it worked, who did it, and what it cost. To understand why anyone would risk their life floating timber down a river, you have to understand one fundamental problem. In the 1800s, there were no logging trucks. There were no paved roads through the northern forests. There were barely roads at all. The white pine forests of Maine, New Hampshire, Wisconsin, and Minnesota sat hundreds of miles from the sawmills and cities that needed them. And the only highways that connected those forests to civilization were rivers. The Penobscot River in Maine, the Connecticut River running through New England, the St. Croix and the Chippewa in Wisconsin, the Mississippi itself. These weren't just waterways, and they were conveyor belts, and every spring, when the ice broke and the water rose, they became the most dangerous workplaces on the continent. Here is how it all began. All winter long, logging crews cut timber in the deep woods. Camps of 100 men or more would spend 5 or 6 months dropping white pine, spruce, and hemlock in temperatures that could hit 40 below zero. The sound of axes and cross-cut saws carried through the frozen air from before dawn until after dark. So the trees were limbed, bucked into logs 16 to 20 feet long, and then skidded by horse teams over ice roads to the nearest riverbank. Those ice roads were an engineering feat in their own right. Crews sprinkled water on the packed snow trails at night, letting it freeze into a glassy surface that reduced friction, and let a single team of horses haul loads that would have been impossible on bare ground. A good teamster could move 5,000 or 6,000 board feet of timber in a single trip. The horse's breath clouding in the pre-dawn dark, the runners of the sled hissing over ice, the load creaking and groaning behind them. At the riverbank, the logs were stacked in massive piles called rollways, sometimes 30 or 40 feet high, waiting for the spring thaw. Picture a wall of timber 100 yards long, 3 stories tall, held in place by nothing more than gravity, a few chains, and the frozen earth beneath it. Some rollways held 10,000 logs or more. They lined the rivers for miles, one after another, each one representing an entire winter's work for a crew of men who had lived in the woods since October. Every man in camp knew that when the thaw came and those logs released, the first few minutes would be the most dangerous of the entire drive. Because a rollway doesn't release gently. It goes all at once, thousands of tons of timber crashing into moving water, by rolling and tumbling and stacking against each other with a sound one survivor described as continuous thunder that shook the ground under your boots. The earth trembled, the riverbank crumbled, and if you were standing too close, you did not get a second chance. Men died at rollways before the drive even started. A single log shifting in the pile could trigger a cascade, an avalanche of timber that moved faster than a man could run. You had maybe 2 seconds to react. If you were standing in the wrong spot, the logs rolled over you like you were not there. In 1885, a rollway collapse on the Machias River in Maine killed 3 men instantly. The crew heard the cracking sound first, that deep groan of settling timber, and then the whole face of the rollway let go. The 3 men who died were standing at the base, marking logs. Their bodies were not recovered for 2 weeks, buried under timber at the river's edge. But if the rollway went clean, if the logs hit the water and started moving, the drive was on. The logs hit the current and began floating downstream. And that is when the river drivers went to work. Now, when I say river driver, I want you to picture this clearly. These were men, usually between 18 and 35 years old, standing on floating logs in moving water. Not on rafts, not on boats, on individual logs, sometimes no more than 12 inches in diameter, spinning and rolling beneath their feet. They use pike poles, wooden shafts about 12 feet long with a steel spike and hook on the end to push, pull, and steer logs through the current. The caulked boots were the only thing between a driver and the river. The soles had dozens of short steel spikes driven through them, about a 1/4 inch long, which bit into the bark and gave just enough grip to keep your footing on a wet, spinning log. Just enough. Not always enough. The sound of those spikes on timber was a particular sharp clicking, almost musical, as the drivers walked and shifted their weight. Every driver could identify another driver by the sound of his boots on wood. A driver who lost his footing went into the water, and in April and early May, that water was barely above freezing. The rivers were running with snow melt straight off the mountains. You had minutes before hypothermia started shutting your body down. And that assumed a log didn't crack your skull on the way in. The cold hit you like a fist. It drove the air from your lungs. Your muscles seized. Your fingers went numb almost immediately, which meant grabbing a pike pole or a rescue rope became a matter of life and death that your own body was working against. The drives moved downstream at whatever pace the river allowed. On wide, calm stretches, the logs spread out and floated lazily, and the work was almost peaceful. Each drivers walked along the banks or rowed bateaux, the flat-bottomed boats that accompanied every drive, keeping an eye on the timber and nudging strays back into the current with long-handled peavies. But peaceful stretches never lasted long, because every river had narrows, every river had bends, every river had rapids, and every one of those features could turn a smooth drive into a catastrophe in seconds. When logs hit a narrow section of river, they bunched together. When they hit a sharp bend, they piled against the outside bank where the current pushed hardest. When they hit rapids, they tumbled and collided and sometimes shattered, sending splinters the size of your arm spinning through the air. And when enough logs stopped moving in the same place at the same time, you got the thing every driver feared more than the cold water itself: a log jam. A real log jam is nothing like what you're imagining right now. And forget the picture of a few logs tangled together. A major jam on a river like the Penobscot or the St. Croix could involve tens of thousands of individual logs, millions of board feet of timber, stacked and interlocked and wedged together across the entire width of the river, sometimes rising 15 or 20 feet above the water's surface. Behind the jam, the river backed up, flooding the banks, creating a lake of logs that could stretch a mile or more upstream. In 1868, a jam on the Chippewa River in Wisconsin backed up an estimated 150 million board feet of timber over a 15-mile stretch. The jam took 6 weeks to break. 6 weeks of men working on an unstable pile of timber the size of a small town, while the river pushed against it with the accumulated force of an entire watershed's spring runoff. And the water kept coming. Snowmelt does not stop because the logs did. The pressure building behind a major jam was almost beyond comprehension. Imagine an entire river's worth of current pushing against a dam made of loose timber. The logs at the base of the jam were under so much force that they would sometimes splinter and explode, sending shards of wood flying like shrapnel. You could hear a big jam working from a 1/4 mile away, this deep groaning and cracking, like the whole river was in pain. Breaking a log jam was the most dangerous job and the most dangerous profession in America. And it fell to the best drivers on the crew, the men they called jam breakers. Here is what a jam breaker did. He walked out onto the jam itself, onto a tangled, unstable mass of timber suspended over rushing water with the full force of a swollen river pushing against it from behind. Beneath his feet, the logs shifted and settled constantly. Every step was a calculation. Every sound was a warning. His job was to find the key log. Every jam had one, the single log whose position held the entire structure together. find it, free it, and the jam would release. The key log might be at the base of the pile, partially submerged, wedged between boulders where the water roared through gaps in the timber. Or it might be somewhere in the middle, locked against 3 other logs in a geometry that defied easy understanding. Finding it required an almost intuitive grasp of physics, an understanding of pressure and leverage and water dynamics that no textbook could teach. The jam breaker would work his pike pole into the tangle, prying and levering, sometimes chopping with an axe, trying to free that key log without triggering a premature release. Because when a jam broke, it broke all at once. The entire structure would shift, then collapse, and thousands of logs would lurch forward into the current simultaneously. A jam breaker caught on the pile when it released had almost no chance. The logs didn't just fall into the water, they rolled, twisted, dove underwater, and resurfaced unpredictably. The water beneath churned into white froth that could hold a man under for minutes. Men caught in a breaking jam were pulled under, crushed between logs, or battered against rocks with no way to protect themselves. Their bodies sometimes surfaced miles downstream. So battered, they were identified only by their boots or the marks on their pike poles. Sometimes they never surfaced at all, pinned to the riverbed under tons of timber. On the Penobscot River in the 1870s and 1880s, a major jam broke loose near the town of Old Town with such violence that the sound was heard 3 miles away. Spectators who watched from the bridge said the logs moved like a living thing, a wall of timber surging forward, grinding everything in its path, the water rising 6 feet in a matter of seconds. The men who broke jams knew exactly what they were risking. They did it anyway, partly because the drive could not continue until the jam was cleared, and every day the timber sat still was money lost for the lumber company, but also because there was a fierce, unspoken pride in the work. The jam breaker was the bravest man on the river, and everyone knew it. He walked where others wouldn't, and he did it with a steadiness that bordered on something almost spiritual. A skilled jam breaker in the 1880s might earn $3 a day. Adjusted for today, that is roughly $100 to walk onto a pile of timber that could kill you in the time it takes to draw a breath. Not every obstacle was a jam. The rivers themselves presented challenges that would stop any modern workforce cold. Waterfalls. The drives encountered actual waterfalls, and the logs went over them. On the Penobscot, the logs ran through a series of falls and rapids near Old Town and Milford that dropped the river 30 feet in less than a mile. Drivers positioned themselves at critical points along the falls, standing on rocks slick with spray, using their pike poles to keep logs from wedging against the ledges and creating jams in places where a jam would be nearly impossible to break. One misstep on those rocks and you were in the falls with the timber. The water there was a boiling chaos of white foam, submerged boulders, and spinning logs. A man who fell in at the head of the falls had maybe 30 seconds before the river decided his fate. Some rivers had log sluices built alongside the worst drops, essentially wooden chutes that channeled logs around the most dangerous sections. These sluices were crude but effective structures, built from heavy timber and braced against the riverbank with stone and iron. Building and maintaining them was its own form of dangerous labor, as repair crews worked in and around moving water and shifting timber to keep them functional before and during the drives. Then there were the splash dams. In smaller tributaries and headwater streams where the main river was still miles away, the water level was often too low to float logs naturally, so the lumber companies built temporary dams across the streams, or holding back the water until it pooled deep enough to create a head of pressure. Then they opened the dam and released a wall of water that carried the logs downstream in a controlled flood. Controlled being a generous word. Splash dam releases were violent, unpredictable surges that stripped the riverbanks bare, tore out vegetation, and sent logs rocketing downstream at speeds that no man could match on foot. Drivers had to stay clear of the initial surge, usually climbing the bank and waiting for the worst to pass, then moving in quickly to manage the timber as the water level stabilized. If a man timed it wrong, if he moved in too early, the tail end of the surge could catch him and drag him under. On the west branch of the Penobscot alone, there were more than 30 splash dams at the height of the log driving era. Each one represented a calculated gamble, a man-made flood released on purpose. With men standing downstream, waiting to work in its aftermath. The men who did this work came from a specific world. In Maine and New Hampshire, they were often the sons and grandsons of loggers, men who grew up in timber country and knew the rivers the way a farmer knows the contours of his own land. They could name every rapid, every eddy, every submerged boulder on 50 miles of river. That knowledge was survival, and it was passed down the way family recipes are, through repetition and correction and watching carefully. In Wisconsin and Minnesota, the crews included large numbers of Scandinavian immigrants, Finns, Swedes, and Norwegians who brought their own logging traditions from the old country, where timber had been floated down rivers for centuries. They were tough, quiet men, many of whom spoke little English, but their skill on the water was undeniable. French Canadians made up an enormous portion of the driving crews as well, men who crossed the border for seasonal work and brought with them a culture of river driving that stretched all the way back to the fur trade and the voyageur tradition. They were not romantic figures, at least not in their own time. They were working men, plain and simple. They smelled like river water, pine pitch, and wood smoke. Their hands were cracked and calloused to the point where the skin on their palms was nearly a quarter-inch thick. Their clothes were wool, even in spring. Socks, because wool keeps you warm when it is wet, and you were always wet on the drive. They wore heavy flannel shirts, stagged pants cut short above the ankle so the cuffs wouldn't snag on logs or brush, and those caulked boots that chewed up every wooden floor they ever walked across. A river driver was not welcome in most hotel lobbies, and not just because of his manners. The work started before dawn and ended after dark. A typical drive might last 4 to 8 weeks, depending on the distance and the river conditions. The men slept in canvas tents along the banks or on some of the bigger drives, aboard large bateaux called whanigans that served as floating cookhouses and bunkhouses. The whanigan was the beating heart of the drive. It carried the food, the cooking equipment, the medical supplies, such as they were, and whatever dry clothing was available. It followed the drive downstream, portaged around the worst drops, and anchored wherever the crew made camp for the night. The cook was one of the highest paid men on the drive, and for good reason. Keeping 100 men fed and functional in the middle of nowhere, with nothing but a cast iron stove and whatever supplies you could carry on a flat-bottom boat, was a logistics challenge that rivaled the driving itself. Breakfast was served at 4 in the morning, because the men were on the water by first light. Salt pork, beans, pancakes, molasses, and black coffee so strong you could almost chew it. Lunch was packed in tin pails and eaten wherever you happened to be standing, which was often on a log in the middle of the river. Dinner was the big meal, served when the crew came off the water at dusk, and a good cook could lift the morale of an entire crew with a pot of stew and fresh biscuits. A bad cook could destroy it just as fast. There are accounts of drives where the men threatened to walk off the job over the quality of the food. And the foreman had to send a runner 50 miles to the nearest town to find a replacement cook before he lost his entire crew. The injuries on a log drive were constant and varied. Sprains, cuts, broken fingers, bruised ribs, blisters that covered entire palms. Those were so routine that men barely mentioned them. You wrapped a bandage around it if you had one and kept working. The serious injuries were something else entirely. Legs snapped between colliding logs, the bones crushed to fragments, skulls fractured by pike poles swung in close quarters, shoulders dislocated when a peavey caught wrong on a spinning log, and hypothermia, always hypothermia, from immersion in ice-cold water that could happen multiple times in a single day. A driver who went into the water was hauled out by his crewmates, given a shot of whiskey if the foreman was the generous sort, and sent back to work. There was no warming tent, there was no mandatory rest period, there was no occupational health assessment. You wrung out your shirt, stamped your boots on the bank to get feeling back in your feet, and you went back onto the logs. Because the timber was still moving, and if you weren't there to manage it, a jam could form that would cost everyone days of extra work. And then there were the drownings. The drowning rate on log drives is impossible to calculate with precision, because records in the early decades were incomplete or non-existent, and lumber companies had every financial and legal incentive to undercount their dead. But the numbers we do have are staggering. On the Penobscot River alone, an estimated 200 men drowned during the log driving era. That is one river in one state. Scale that across every major timber river in the Northeast, the Great Lakes states, and the upper Mississippi watershed, and the total death count reaches well into the thousands. The Penobscot Log Driving Company kept some records, and they paint a picture that is hard to look at for long. In some years, 3 or 4 men died on a single drive. In bad years, the number was higher. The dead were usually young, 22, 25, 28 years old, men who had been alive and strong at breakfast and were gone by noon. Their names were entered in company ledgers with a cause of death that was almost always the same: drowned, occasionally crushed by logs, rarely anything more specific. It's because specificity would have required someone to witness the death, and many drownings on the drive happened with no witnesses at all. A man was there, and then he wasn't. Some of the deaths became legends in their own right. Joe Atten, a Penobscot Indian and one of the finest river drivers in Maine history, drowned on the West Branch in 1870 when a jam broke beneath him. He had broken hundreds of jams before. He knew the risk better than any white man on the crew. The river took him anyway, and the Penobscot Nation lost one of its most respected members to the same industry that was stripping their ancestral lands of timber. John Ross, a driver on the Kennebec, was killed in 1882 when a log rolled over him in shallow rapids. The water was barely 3 feet deep, but a 16-foot pine log weighing 800 pounds does not need deep water to kill you. It just needs to catch you between itself and a rock. And in that moment, you're nothing more than flesh against wood and stone. These men were not reckless. They were skilled, experienced, and careful within the limits of what the work allowed. But the work itself was inherently lethal. You cannot stand on floating timber in a swollen river and eliminate risk. You can manage it. You can read the water, choose your footing, time your moves, and some days that is enough, and some days it is not. And with the peak of the log driving era in America stretched from roughly 1850 to 1910. During those decades, the numbers were almost incomprehensible. The Penobscot River carried an estimated 1 billion board feet of timber in a single season at its peak. Think about that for a moment. 1 billion board feet. That is enough lumber to build more than 60,000 houses, enough to frame entire neighborhoods, entire towns, and it all went down one river, pushed and guided and managed by men standing on the logs themselves. The Mississippi River and its tributaries carried even more. The Chippewa River in Wisconsin was sometimes so choked with logs during the spring drives that you could walk across it without getting your feet wet, literally walk from one bank to the other on a solid carpet of floating timber that covered the entire surface of the water for miles on end. And somewhere in that mass of wood were men with pike poles, trying to keep the whole thing from grinding to a halt. The lumber companies that organized these drives were among the wealthiest enterprises in 19th century America. Bangor, Maine became one of the richest cities per capita in the country, almost entirely because of the timber that floated down the Penobscot to its sawmills. The mills along the river processed millions of board feet every season, and the lumber shipped out on coastal schooners to build Boston, New York, Philadelphia, and cities up and down the eastern seaboard. The smell of fresh-cut pine hung over the city like a permanent fog. In Wisconsin and Minnesota, the story repeated itself. The white pine forests of the Great Lakes region fed the explosive expansion of Chicago after the Great Fire of 1871 built the railroad towns of the Great Plains and provided the raw material for a nation growing faster than anyone had imagined possible. And at the very bottom of that supply chain, and standing knee-deep in ice water with nothing between them and death but a pair of spiked boots and a wooden pole, were the river drivers. They were paid by the day. In the 1850s, a driver earned about $1 to $1.50 per day, plus board. By the 1880s, wages had climbed to $2 or $3 a day. The foremen, the men who organized the drive, read the river, positioned the crews, and made the critical decisions about when and where to break jams, earned somewhat more. But even the foremen's wages were modest compared to the profits flowing upstream into the lumber baron's accounts. Isaac Stevenson, a lumber baron who operated out of Marinette, Wisconsin, was worth an estimated $50 million at his peak. The men who drove his logs downstream earned maybe $150 for an entire season of work that could kill them on any given Tuesday. This was the fundamental equation of the log drive, and of the American timber industry as a whole. The labor was brutal, the pay was low, and the profits were extraordinary. The men knew it. They were not naive. But the alternatives in timber country were limited. You could farm if the thin, rocky soil would allow it. You could fish. You could work in a sawmill, which had its own grim catalog of injuries. Or you could go into the woods in winter and onto the rivers in spring, because that was where the work was. The culture of the log drive was its own enclosed world, with its own language, on its own customs, its own moral code. The drivers had their own songs, ballads sung in English and French that told stories of men who drowned on specific rivers, of legendary jam breakers, of winters so cold the trees exploded. They had their own slang. A skilled driver was a white water man. A dangerous stretch of river was a hell gate. The lead man on a jam was the bull of the woods. The logs themselves were sticks, and the river was always she, always feminine, and always treated with the kind of wary respect you would give something beautiful that could also kill you. Saturday nights on the drive, if the crew happened to be near a town, meant a trip to the nearest saloon. River drivers were famous for three things in equal measure: their drinking, their fighting, and their spending. A man who had been cold, wet, exhausted, and terrified for 6 straight days was not inclined toward moderation on his one night off. The towns along the major drive routes developed entire seasonal economies around the spring log runs. Saloons, boarding houses, general stores, and establishments of considerably less reputable character all catered to the drivers and their wages. Bangor's infamous Devil's Half-Acre district was sustained almost entirely by the timber industry, and the river drivers were its most reliable customers. But the drives were not all hardship and violence and cold water. There was a pride in the work that comes through in every surviving account, every interview, every letter home. The river drivers considered themselves the elite of the logging industry. The camp loggers who felled the trees were respected, but the men who ran the rivers held a special status. They were doing something that required extraordinary physical skill, genuine courage, and an intimate knowledge of moving water that took years to develop. A good driver could read the river the way a sailor reads the wind. He knew where the current ran fast, where it eddied, where the rocks lurked just below the surface. He knew which bends would jam and which would flow clean. He could tell, from the sound of the water alone, whether a stretch ahead was safe or whether it was about to become a killing field. The old drivers passed their knowledge down with a seriousness that bordered on ceremony. Fathers taught sons. Experienced men took newcomers under their watch and showed them how to plant their feet, how to shift their weight on a rolling log, how to read the subtle signs that a jam was about to break. The learning curve was steep, and the consequences of ignorance were immediate, but the men who survived their first few drives became something rare. They became artists on the water. They could ride a single spinning log through Class 3 rapids, shifting their weight with a balance that looked effortless and was anything but. They could leap from log to log across a moving raft of timber without breaking stride. They could spot a jam forming from a quarter mile upstream and position themselves to prevent it before the first log even arrived. This skill was real, it was physical, and it was earned through years of practice in conditions that would shut down any modern job site before the first man got his boots wet. The end came gradually, and then all at once, railroads pushed deeper into the timber country through the late 1800s, offering a faster and more predictable way to move logs from forest to mill. Logging railroads, narrow-gauge lines, built specifically to haul timber, penetrated into valleys and ridgelines that rivers could never reach. Log trucks appeared in the early 1900s. Crude at first, but increasingly practical as roads improved. By the 1910s and 1920s, the great river drives were dwindling. Fewer logs on the water each spring, fewer crews needed, fewer young men learning the old skills. But it was not technology alone that killed the log drive. The forests themselves were disappearing. The white pine that had made the whole industry possible, trees that had stood for 300 and 400 years, had been cut so aggressively and so relentlessly that by the early 1900s, and there simply wasn't enough timber left to justify the massive spring drives. The lumber companies moved on, some chasing Douglas fir and redwood in the Pacific Northwest, others pivoting into different industries entirely. The rivers that had carried billions of board feet were left quiet and empty. The last major log drive on the Penobscot River took place in 1933. The very last log drive in the United States was on the Kennebec River in Maine in 1976. When those final logs floated down the Kennebec, pushed along by a small handful of men who were the last living practitioners of a vanishing art, something that had shaped the American landscape for over a century came to a quiet, almost unnoticed end. The rivers recovered, slowly and then completely. Without the annual battering of millions of logs, the banks healed, the fish populations returned, and the waterways reverted to something closer to their natural state. Environmentally, the end of log driving was a good thing. The drives had scoured riverbeds down to bare rock, destroyed fish-spawning habitat, stripped banks of vegetation, and polluted the water with bark, sawdust, and debris. Splash dams had altered the natural hydrology of dozens of waterways. The ecological recovery of these rivers stands as one of the quieter, less celebrated success stories of American conservation. But something was lost too. And I don't mean a profession, although a profession was certainly lost. I mean a particular kind of relationship between human beings and the physical world. The river drivers did not operate machinery. They did not sit in climate-controlled cabs behind glass and steel. They stood on the thing they were moving, inside the element that could kill them, and they used their own bodies, their own balance, their own judgment, and their own nerve to do the work. There was no buffer between a driver and the river, no safety system, to no emergency shutoff, no algorithm calculating acceptable risk on his behalf. Just a man, a pike pole, a pair of spiked boots, and moving water that did not care whether he lived or died. That kind of work produces a kind of knowledge that cannot be written in a manual or taught in a classroom. It lives in the body, in the way your feet feel the log shifting a half second before your eyes register the movement, in the way your arms know, from pure repetition, and exactly how much force to apply with the pike pole to turn a log without flipping it, in the way your ears can read the change in the river's voice around a bend you haven't seen yet, and tell you whether what's ahead is passable or deadly. This was not unskilled labor. It was deeply, profoundly skilled labor that happened to be performed by men who wore wool shirts and caulked boots instead of suits and credentials. And when the last drive ended, that knowledge went with it. You cannot learn to drive logs on a river that no longer carries timber. You cannot apprentice under men who have been dead for half a century. The skill, the culture, the songs, the particular form of courage it required, all of it faded within a single generation. Today, if you drive through northern Maine or the timber country of Wisconsin, you will see rivers that look wild and untouched. The forests have grown back, second growth and third growth, but green and thick and alive. The towns that once hummed with the energy of the spring log drive are quiet places now. Their economies shifted to tourism, paper mills, or whatever work remains in a region the big money left behind long ago. In some of those towns, there are small monuments, a bronze plaque bolted to a bridge abutment, a rusted pike pole, and a pair of caulked boots in a glass case at a county historical museum. A faded photograph tacked to the wall of a general store showing a dozen men standing on a log jam, or in their faces half obscured by distance and time and the grain of the photograph. These are the only markers left for an entire profession, an entire way of life, that physically built the infrastructure of a growing nation. The Penobscot River still flows through Maine, the same as it always did. It is clean now, stocked with Atlantic salmon, popular with kayakers and fly fishermen who come up from Portland and Boston for long weekends. If you stand on its banks in late April, when the water runs high and dark with snowmelt, you can hear the same roar that greeted the drivers every spring. The same cold water rushes over the same rocks. The same rapids churn white in the places where logs once tumbled and men once stood. But the men are gone. The 10,000 who walked out onto the ice every spring with their pike poles and their spiked boots, who rode timber through whitewater and broke jams with their bare hands and their own bodies, who drowned in rivers whose names most Americans will never learn. They built this country one log at a time, and they did it with a skill and a courage that we have no modern equivalent for. We owe them houses. We owe them cities. We owe them the railroad ties that stitched a continent together, and we have repaid that debt with nothing but forgetfulness. The rivers remember, though, even if we don't.